Welcome to the deep dive from Standing in the Gaps News. Today we are diving deep into a day that shook Washington to its core.
Oh, yeah.
January 20th, 2025, the day President Trump started his second term.
What's remarkable is that he didn't ease back in or anything. We're looking at a mountain of executive orders, proclamations, memos, all signed on day one. This is a level of immediate policy action I don't think we've really seen in modern presidencies.
It's like he walked in and said, all right, game on.
Yeah.
We've got trade shakeups, TikTok's in the hot seat again,
Yeah.
national emergency at the border, a hiring freeze across the government, with some very interesting exceptions.
And that's what's so fascinating about these exceptions, the specific targets. They all start to paint this picture of what this administration's priorities are and what their vision for this term is going to be.
All right, so let's unpack this. Where do you even begin to analyze a day like this?
The sheer volume of it tells us this wasn't just a scattershot approach. There's a deliberate strategy here. To understand it, a good place to start is with trade. Classic Trump area, but it's been taken to another level.
America First trade policy, he wasted no time putting that back front and center. This time there's talk of a global supplemental tariff. What does that even mean? And who is it aimed at?
That's the million-dollar question. It's
Yeah.
not about specific countries anymore. It seems to be about a fundamental shift in how the U.S. is approaching global trade. This memo calls for investigating all trade deficits, not just those with China.
Right.
And it hints at using this sweeping tariffs as leverage to reshape these deals.
So he's not just tweaking the system, he's trying to rewrite the rules of the game entirely.
Seems that way.
I mean, that's going to ruffle some feathers.
For sure.
Okay.
And there's another really interesting detail in this memo. There's a proposal to create a new agency,
What?
an external revenue service, specifically to collect tariffs and duties. So it could be a way to streamline enforcement, maybe centralize control.
Okay.
But it also raises some concerns about bureaucracy, the potential for abuse. It's like he's creating his own little economic enforcement arm.
Kind of, yeah.
And this all comes alongside scrutinizing deals with China, maybe renegotiating USMCA. It's like he's throwing down the gauntlet to the entire world.
It's definitely a strong signal. It's a huge departure from traditional trade policy. And it'll be interesting to see how other countries react to this.
Will they retaliate? Will they try to negotiate? We're in uncharted territory here.
Okay, let's move on to something that hits a little closer to home for a lot of Americans.
Sure.
TikTok, we all remember the dramas surrounding this app during the last administration. It seems those national security concerns are back.
Yeah, and they've been addressed head-on with an executive order halting the enforcement of the Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary-Controlled Applications Act for 75 days. A pause to reassess the situation.
A little bit of breathing room for TikTok. But what happens after those 75 days? Is this a stay of execution or just a delay?
The order says the administration needs this time to determine the next steps and to consult with advisors on a resolution that protects national security. So there's no clear answer yet, but the language suggests they're trying to find a solution that doesn't necessarily involve a complete ban.
It's a really complicated issue. TikTok has a massive user base here in the U.S., but there are legitimate concerns about data security and the potential for foreign influence.
For sure.
It'll be interesting to see how this plays out.
It's a classic balancing act. National security versus individual liberties, economic interests versus geopolitical considerations. It's a microcosm of the challenges any administration faces in today's world.
So we've got trade wars brewing, TikTok still hanging in the balance, and we're just getting started. But before we dive into the other major policy areas, we wanted to remind you.
We're passionate about bringing you in-depth analysis here at Standing in the Gaps News, and you being here listening really helps us do that.
Exactly. We've got a GoFundMe campaign, going to upgrade our equipment.
Yeah.
All the stuff that helps us reach even more people with these deep dives that you love. Every little bit helps, and we appreciate your support.
Sponsor break, vidIQ, because you deserve to go viral. Let's be real, YouTube's algorithm is ruthless. You spend hours editing, post your video, and get 12 views. Pain. That's where vidIQ comes in. It's like having a YouTube coach, AI assistant, and marketing guru all in one. Find trending topics before they pop off. Get AI-generated video ideas so you're never stuck staring at a blank screen. Analyze your competition and see what's working for them. Rank higher in search so you don't stay stuck at 47 subscribers forever. Stop posting into the void. Level up with vidIQ. Link in the description.
Now let's get back to those executive orders because things are about to get really interesting. All right, so we've talked trade wars, we've talked about TikTok and all the drama surrounding that, but let's shift gears now to an issue that's been a cornerstone of this president's entire platform,
Mhm.
immigration and border security.
Yeah, this is where we see some of the most dramatic and immediate actions. The president declared a national emergency at the southern border, citing cartels, human trafficking, drug smuggling as major threats.
A national emergency declaration, I mean, that's not something you see every day. What are the implications of a move like that?
It gives the president a lot of authority to allocate resources to bypass certain legal restrictions. In this case, the proclamation calls for deploying the armed forces to help Homeland Security secure the border.
Wow, okay, so troops to the border? That's a significant escalation, and I'm sure it's going to be controversial what else is in this proclamation.
It also directs the construction of additional physical barriers along the border, continuing those efforts from the first term, but taking it a step further with the urgency of a national emergency.
So it's a multi-pronged approach. We've got the troops, we've got the barriers, and I think just a really clear message that this is a top priority for this administration. This kind of ties in with the whole America First theme that we were talking about with the trade policy, doesn't it?
It does. It's about asserting control, protecting American interests, and I think projecting strength, both at home and abroad. And that's a pattern we're seeing across a lot of these day one actions.
That's a bold strategy, that's for sure. Boldness seems to be the name of the game today. All right, let's turn to another issue that I think is really pressing for a lot of Americans right now, and that's the economy. Inflation has been a major concern, and it seems like the president wanted to address that right away.
He issued a memorandum specifically targeting inflation, focusing on key areas like housing costs, healthcare expenses, regulations that impact things like appliance prices. The goal is clear, trying to ease that burden on American families.
Okay, so a plan that I think everyone can get behind,
Sure.
but how exactly are they going to tackle these issues? These are really complex problems, and the memo doesn't really seem to lay out any concrete solution.
Right. It's more of a broad directive at this point, calling for appropriate actions to lower costs, eliminate those unnecessary expenses.
Right.
But the specifics, we'll have to wait and see.
Okay, so a clear objective, but the methods are still taking shape.
Exactly.
It'll be interesting to see what those appropriate actions turn out to be. And hey, if you're finding this deep dive insightful, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends.
Help us spread the word.
We rely on you guys to keep bringing you this kind of analysis, so thank you for your support. Okay, so on top of addressing inflation, there's another big move on the economic front. That's this hiring freeze across the federal government.
Classic cost-cutting measure, often seen as a way to reduce government spending, maybe even shrink the size of the bureaucracy a little bit.
Right, but it's not a blanket freeze, is it?
No, you're right. There are some interesting exceptions.
And those exceptions tell us a lot about where this administration's priorities lie.
The order specifically exempts positions related to immigration enforcement, national security, public safety, and essential services. So even as they're trying to reduce spending, they're still prioritizing those areas.
Like the strategic reallocation of resources, right?
I think so.
It aligns with that focus on border security and those national security concerns with TikTok that we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. A leaner government, but one that's very focused on those key areas.
Okay, so we've got the national emergency at the border, efforts to combat inflation, a hiring freeze with some very telling exceptions. I think it's clear this administration is not shying away from taking bold action. But this day wasn't just about policy changes, it was also about accountability.
Yeah, and this is where things get really interesting. The president also signed an executive order aimed at investigating what he called the weaponization of the federal government against political opponents.
Weaponization, that's a strong word.
It is.
What exactly is he referring to?
Well, the order doesn't specifically define it, but it seems to be aimed at any instance where federal law enforcement or intelligence agencies were maybe used for political purposes rather than legitimate national security or law enforcement objectives.
So it's basically he's saying that the previous administration might have used its power to target its political rivals.
Yeah, essentially it's a pretty serious accusation. The order directs the Attorney General and the Director of National Intelligence to review activities over the past 4 years and identify any instances where those agencies' conduct was maybe inconsistent with the order's purpose.
So this is going to be like a deep dive into the workings of the previous administration. You can bet that it's going to be highly scrutinized by everybody.
It's like opening up Pandora's box, potentially leading to even more division, even more mistrust.
We're already seeing some really strong reactions from both sides. Okay, so what else is in this order besides the investigations into this potential weaponization?
Well, it also calls for review of any potential misconduct related to censorship of protected speech, particularly focusing on making sure that federal officers and employees aren't infringing on those First Amendment rights. So it's about protecting free speech, preventing government overreach in that realm.
Okay, so we've got investigations into weaponization, we've got investigations into censorship. This is some heavy stuff, but it doesn't stop there.
No.
There were also some very specific actions taken on day one targeting individuals.
51 former intelligence officials had their security clearances revoked.
What was the reasoning behind that?
These individuals had questioned a news story about Hunter Biden's laptop during the 2020 election.
Okay.
And the order alleges that they basically coordinated with the Biden campaign to discredit the story, to falsely suggest that it was part of a Russian disinformation campaign. So it's directly challenging the actions and the credibility of these former officials.
So they're being accused of interfering in the election for political gain,
Exactly.
which I guess ties in with this whole idea of rooting out corruption and holding people accountable.
Precisely. The order criticizes their actions, saying that it was a breach of trust, a manipulation of the political process. So it's a clear signal that this administration is willing to take action against those it deems, responsible for this.
And let's not forget about former National Security Advisor John Bolton.
Oh, right.
He also lost his security clearance.
He did, and this action is tied to his publication of that memoir that allegedly contained classified information from his time in government.
Right.
So the order frames this as a violation of national security, a breach of trust.
The president is sending a very clear message here. He's in charge, and he's not afraid to use his power to hold people accountable.
I think that's a fair assessment.
And this one I think you'll find interesting. Remember Schedule F? The executive order that made it easier to dismiss federal employees in those policy influencing roles? It was rescinded by the Biden administration. But guess what?
What?
It's back. President Trump reinstated it on day one.
Another one of those undoing the previous administration's actions and reasserting control over those levers of government.
Exactly. But remind us what Schedule F does and why it's so controversial.
Well, it essentially reclassifies certain federal employees and makes it a lot easier to fire them without the usual procedural safeguards in place. This is meant to streamline the process of removing employees who are seen as maybe obstructing the president's agenda or acting against the administration.
So basically a way to remove those career bureaucrats who might be resistant to the new administration's policies.
That's one way to look at it. Yeah.
One that I'm sure will be used strategically. Right. We've got a national emergency at the border, efforts to combat inflation, a hiring freeze with some telling exceptions. We've got investigations into weaponization of the government censorship, revoked security clearances, and the revival of Schedule F.
It's a lot.
I'm exhausted just talking about it.
It really highlights this dramatic shift we're seeing in Washington. This administration is not holding back, and they're making it very clear what their priorities are.
If you're feeling overwhelmed by all this information, don't worry. That's why we're here at Standing in the Gaps News. We break down these complex issues so you don't have to. And as always, don't forget, liking, subscribing, sharing all of that helps us reach more people with these deep dives. And we really appreciate it. It helps us grow, and it lets us know what you want to hear about. So keep those comments coming. And I don't know about you, but I'm still trying to process everything we've talked about so far.
It's a lot to take in. Yeah.
You know, we spent the last segments just going through all these actions from President Trump's first day back in office. It's been a whirlwind, and now we have to try and figure out what it all means, right? What does this all mean for the future? I think we see this clear America First agenda.
Yeah.
But what are the consequences of that? What does this look like, both here at home and on the world stage?
Well, domestically, I think we can expect some pushback. This level of executive action is bound to face legal challenges, probably some congressional gridlock, even some internal dissent within his own party.
Yeah, governing isn't a solo act, right?
No, it's not.
Even with the second term, he's going to need to build alliances, he's going to need to compromise, and he's got to navigate a political landscape that's even more polarized than it was before.
Absolutely. And then there's economic impact to consider these trade policies, this potential global tariff war. We were talking about the hiring freeze.
Right.
All of that could have ripple effects throughout the economy. Jobs, consumer prices.
It's a lot of uncertainty.
It is.
And I think uncertainty breeds anxiety in the markets. For everyday Americans, it's not just about what's happening within our borders either, these policies. I think they're going to send shockwaves across the globe.
Oh, for sure. I think the president's America First approach, it signals a potential shift away from multilateralism, global cooperation, and that could strain relationships with some key allies and maybe even embolden some adversaries like China and Russia.
So we might see a more isolationist America, more focused on its own interests and maybe less engaged in these international affairs.
And I think the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement is a perfect example of that. It sends that message, environmental concerns taking a backseat to those economic interests.
And that decision, I think, is going to have consequences for global efforts to combat climate change.
Absolutely.
It feels like we're entering this whole new era, one with the potential for significant challenges, but also some unforeseen opportunities.
You never really know how these things are going to play out.
It's going to be a fascinating ride. I think maybe a little bit bumpy. But as always, we here at Standing at the Gaps News, we're going to be here to break it all down for you guys. We'll continue to provide the in-depth analysis, the deep dives that you love. So stay tuned, stay engaged, and don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave your thoughts in the comments. We really appreciate your feedback. It helps us grow and lets us know what you want to hear about. And before we sign off, I wanted to remind you about our ongoing GoFundMe campaign.
Please consider supporting us.
Your support helps us upgrade our equipment so we can keep bringing you these high-quality deep dives and hopefully reach an even wider audience.
We really appreciate every contribution.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the first day of President Trump's second term. Until next time, stay curious, keep learning, and never stop asking questions. This is the Standing of the Gaps News Deep Dive signing off.